Hear ye, the end is near. AI is coming for the sales profession. Isn't that what we keep seeing all over the place? AI is going to crush the SDR. It's going to crush this. It's going to crush that. Well, we actually know what happens in situations like this through the lens of history because it's actually happened over and over again. You might be thinking, well, AI is different, but is it? In today's episode, let's dig into this question. Will AI replace salespeople? What sales history tells us? This is Season 5, Episode number 2.
There is nothing new in the world of sales except for the history you do not know. Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, bringing the brilliant and sometimes strange minds, methods, and ideas from the sales profession's past with applications to today. Here is your host, the best-selling author of 2 books with a third coming in January of 2026, CSP speaker, trainer, and nerd, Todd Caponi.
All right, so there's so many posts warning of the impact of AI on the sales profession, and they mostly all say the same thing. Actually, the same thing as you'd see throughout history every time there has been either a significant shift in the world of business or a significant downturn. And the result has been the same each time, too. Will AI have the same outcome and impact? Well, let's look through history and tell the stories, and then you decide. So let's start by looking at the era from 1870 to 1900. It was a time when the U.S. population had doubled. Increasing immigration and urbanization had helped the shift from small-scale manufacturing and commerce to large-scale factory production and enormous national corporations. I mean, essentially, companies figured out manufacturing, and they figured out manufacturing at scale. I mean, you weren't producing a few rugs or shoes and then hiring traveling salespeople to take your products along with all the other people's town to town, and that wasn't going to work anymore. You needed dedicated salespeople to meet this production, meet this demand. In 1903, in Salesmanship magazine, they had talked about kind of the this era as things were changing, that the traveling salesman is, in a certain sense, looked upon as a newspaper. That is, he is the principal source from which information of the outside world is gained by the merchant. So salespeople had been invited in. They weren't seen as gross for the most part because they were educators. That was the old way. Education, though, was always the core. But for this new world of manufacturing, this new world of demand, massive growth, selling had to change. Organizations had to start hiring their own salespeople and then teaching them in their ways, having them focus just on their organization. Salespeople had to become essentially service first, meaning experts in their solutions and their impacts, being less focused on the sale and more focused on serving the customer for the long term. Yes, this is 120 years ago. Serving the customer for the long term still had to be the focus. Sales was becoming an actual profession. This was the start, the 1890s, really through about 1915. Now, you know I always talk about my favorite, Arthur Sheldon, and he was the one that was laying the foundation starting in 1902. Having been an individual who was selling books, trying to pay his way through college where he was getting his law degree, he had come to this realization that, hey, listen, salespeople, they need that kind of education that I'm getting as a lawyer. They should be trained like lawyers. And he had started the correspondence classes, and his business exploded with growth, and he's really seen as the first one to be providing public-facing sales education. But he had really stamped it. He came right out of the gate with this service mindset. And my favorite quote of his on this subject was in his 1911 book, The Art of Selling, where he said, "True salesmanship is the science of service. Grasp that thought firmly and never let go." So would this modern version of the sales profession be short-lived? Well, Thomas Herbert Russell thought it might in 1910. In his book, Salesmanship, Theory and Practice, he started sounding the alarms by saying, quote, buyers know more nowadays. Does that sound familiar? Well, he was referring to the rise of mail order catalogs and the proliferation of advertising. Sales would have to change dramatically, right? Buyers wouldn't need salespeople. Like, we hear that all the time today. AI is going to put the need for salespeople out of business. But what happened in 1910s? The opposite happened. In 1913, I found this story of a home furnishings retailer just outside of Chicago, the town of around 5,000 people. And the owner of the business was venting about how his business was slipping away because of Russell called out. The catalogs were the cause. And he proclaimed, good luck returning a damaged item. But somehow his business not only survived, but it thrived. It turns out that the catalog couldn't beat him on relationships, on insights, and empathy. He knew his customers. He knew their families. He knew their life events. He knew their financial realities. So when two local kids got engaged, he knew before that catalog house ever could, and was able to help them guide their gift givers, furnish their home, and set them up for the future. So we look at the catalog, the rise of the catalog being massive choice, massive distribution, information going to every single person that requested or every single household. How did we survive? Well, again, in 1917, Dr. Frank Crane said in his Commandments of Salesmanship, be human. Otherwise, your employer would have sent a catalog. Just like that home furnishings retailer, being a human, he knew before the catalog house ever could. He knew them, he knew his customers, and he could provide the insights to them that they weren't going to get in some paper catalog. So that was new game-changing technology, and not a technology per se. It was basically, though, Amazon.com in paper form. The profession survived, and it thrived. It happened through salespeople serving and salespeople educating. Dr. Crane added in a version of that first book in 1923, speaking of the idea that salespeople assume too much knowledge on behalf of their customer. My customer's doing so much research. They must know everything. I should start where they are. Well, Dr. Crane said, quote, they cannot conceive the extent of my ignorance. And I agree with that. I bought a boat. I walked in and the salesperson was talking over my head about stuff I had no idea. All I knew was that a boat floated. I went to buy firewood and they're saying, do you want spruce or do you want oak? Do you want a cord, a half cord? I'm like, what are you talking about? There's this assumption that I've done my research and I know all that stuff. But again, they cannot conceive the extent of my ignorance. Into the 1920s we went. The concept of automation was upon us. Quotes like, behold the robot. Salesmen who know nothing are rapidly being displaced by automation. That showed up in 1929 in the book Salesmanship for the New Era. The proliferation of information, and now we have increasing automation. Here we go again. But again, the profession thrived. Why? Because as Mears added, the main difference between the successful salesperson and the unsuccessful salesperson was not geographical, it was personal. Similar but different. As I mentioned in the opening, the same phenomenon existed during new game-changing technologies as did really poor economies. So let's go on to this next big event that happened, which was the Great Depression. It's created a different type of pressure on the sales profession. In many ways, there was this thing called the Forgotten Depression of the early 1920s that started a downward spiral for the profession in terms of its reputation. But in the 1930s, this Great Depression led organizations to shift almost entirely away from commission-only compensation. And you're wondering, all right, where am I going here? Well, here are the data first. By 1945, only 27% of companies had commission-only types of plans, and a third of those planned to abandon them soon. That was a shift from 1934 to 1945, where there was a much higher percentage. Salary plus commission plans grew from just 25% of plans in 1934 to 56% in 1945. So You went the shift from commission-only plans to variable plus base salary. Why would that happen, and what does that have to do with anything? Well, it was because organizations couldn't let desperation crush their reputations. The Great Depression was creating desperation. They wanted a trust-based type sales organization built through transparency, built through service and education. It was the only way to sustain and grow. Providing the combined base plus variable compensation structure was how organizations sought to exert more control over the message, the process, and the approach. Again, service and education, those two words, instead of desperation and high pressure. That's what got the profession through the Great Depression as well. Now, there's many more instances between the 30s and the 2000s, but let's skip ahead a little bit. I mean, the cycle continued. Either new technology or macroeconomic pressure over and over again. But more recently, let's look at the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009-ish. It led to what became the Challenger sale, and it started in March of 2009. There was a Harvard Business Review article that claimed, quote, "In a downturn, provoke your customers." And then a couple years later, November of 2011, the release of the Challenger sale was really kind of capitalizing on this thought, where teach was always the first step. Now, why did this happen? Well, we saw it with the rise of e-commerce. Analyst firms were claiming that 1 million B2B sales jobs would be going away between 2015 and 2020, and hundreds of thousands of college students would no longer be graduating into the profession. E-commerce, the demise of the sales profession, but the opposite happened again. Now, in each one of these cases, two things have proven to be true. Number one, more access to information hasn't made life easier on your buyers. It's actually made it harder. The answer was, and I believe still is, service. And number two, as Herbert N. Casson said in his 1911 book, Ads and Sales, quote, "No, it is not true, as learned theorists have said, that every great invention springs into life because it is demanded by the nation. It springs into life and nobody wants it. It's the ugly duckling. Everybody prefers 10 cents to it until a few salesmen take it in hand and explain it." The irony of every new game-changing technology is that it's taken more and more salespeople to bring it to market versus less, versus companies just doing their own homework and using it to eliminate the need for salespeople. It required good salespeople. Gordon Pope, in a book called The Process of the Sale in 1920, said, "The man who first sells any article in any place must educate the public up to the idea of his proposition. It takes time and a great deal of persistent hammering to make the majority of people see the value of anything." He told the story of the Gillette safety razor. So way back in the 1910s, 1920s, the entire proposition of a safety razor was based on educating the prospect on what was possible because no one ever heard of it before. So AI has so much incredible potential, of course, but anyone claiming to be an expert is probably lying to themselves, and your buyers especially don't know what's possible yet. They need your help. Our role is to educate the pros and the cons of solutions, to help buyers navigate, know where to look, teach what's important, and help customers achieve optimal outcomes. Frederick A. Russell, in his 1933 book, Textbook of Salesmanship, believed, quote, "Selling goods is merely being a professional buyer for the customer." That, to me, means education. That, to me, means everything when we look at the rise of AI. Every new game-changing technology, every economic downturn, every situation where there was a rise in doomsday predictions for the profession of sales have been resolved by the exact same answer. Menial tasks are not valuable. Service is. It's a good thing for the profession, for the customers, and for the overall economy. And transparency wins. Service and education. I believe we'll be talking about this 5 years from now through that lens, and then we'll be looking forward to what's next that we can be all concerned about, right? Please let me know what you think. Do you agree? I'm certainly no Nostradamus here, but there's so often times that we can actually use history to predict what's going to happen, and it looks so similar to me. So please reach out. You've got ideas, you've got feedback, you've got thoughts, and I love it when you share this with others. But until next time, thanks again for listening.